I chose the article Seeing Like a Settler Colonial State by Margaret Jacobs of University of Nebraska-Lincoln. She defines settler colonialism as a distinct form of colonialism that involves sustained migration and permanent settlement by European descended families, the dispossession of indigenous peoples, and the development of elaborate institutions that allowed settlers and their descendants to gain numerical and political dominance. Sorry for the long definition, but it's crucial to this article, and I wanted to define it up front. So the author points out that Canada and Australia have embraced their settler colonialism approach. They've got a dark history, and they've embraced it, and they've managed to come to some reconciliation with some of their indigenous people. It's a model for success that the United States has shunned. And the author defines the indigenous peoples of America as natives and African Americans. Though they're not from the United States originally, they are an indigenous people, and they have been subject to the brutalities of European culture. So the liberal versus conservative approach. Because our country is a pendulum politically, it swings from conservative control to liberal control. And that's created some issues with the lack of consistency in how we deal with our indigenous people. On the conservative side, the author points out that it has created an attempt to eliminate the culture entirely. The liberals have managed to pull off basically the same effect, though they use different methods, including racial mixing and adoption, which she goes into detail at great length. The author uses children after World War II, indigenous orphans, and their adoption in incredible numbers. The removal of those children from their culture created a hole that we will detail later in this presentation. So the quote, "All nations depend on forgetting, on forging myths of unity and identity that allow a society to forget its founding crimes, its hidden injuries and divisions, its unhealed wounds." That's the legacy that colonialism has left, and that's the idea that the author really focuses on heavily in this article. Canada, in its redressing of this issue, created the Truth and Reconciliation Commission. It allowed people to air their grievances, to report on their historical trauma, and to begin the process of moving forward, knowing that their government heard them. In Australia, the stolen generations were taken from their parents and completely removed from the island they lived on. As far as their people were concerned, they just disappeared. They were raised, as you can see, often by nuns in orphanages. Some of them were placed in homes. Some of them grew to the age of maturity in those schools. The United States, though we also participated in removal, have steadfastly refused to embrace the settler colonial approach, something that has brought great reconciliation and progress in Canada and Australia. The result in America with our indigenous peoples has been that they were forbidden to own land. That was very important to the idea of getting them disseminated out and mixed in with the invading culture so that their cultural identity and claims to land were lost. Not surprisingly, centuries later, rootless, jobless, many of these indigenous people end up in jail. And the removal of their children has created a loss of culture. The damage has been high rates of incarceration, broken homes, and again, the complete loss of their culture, because the children are what carry that on. I taught for 8 years on a reservation in California, and I'm in my second year working at a school that's 71% native, mostly Tlingit, and I've seen the same negative effects of colonialism even hundreds of years later at the school I'm at now in Southeast Alaska. So conservatives and liberals both agreed that there was an indigenous problem, and they wanted to deal with it, but their approaches were vastly different. The conservative approach was to take the land, whether through treaty or bargains or just warfare. It got indigenous peoples off their native land and mixed in, often in the cities, where they basically took on the appearance of the European culture, and their own culture was forgotten. The liberals went out and gave civil rights to people or fought for it. What wasn't realized at the time is that when you give civil rights to a person, you're ignoring their tribe and their culture. So it's possible to completely exterminate a culture by bestowing civil rights. And of course, there was also the miscegenation, the mixing of the races to just create this melting pot idea where people are going to be bred out of existence, essentially. And when that didn't work, in cases that it didn't work, there was forced adoptions. Like, we'll take your children, we'll make them part of our family, we won't let them speak their language, we'll make them cut their hair, and they will forget their culture, and they will grow up as our children and adopt our culture. And in a very short time, how long does it take for a 10-year-old to become a 20-year-old European, in essence? So the author really focused on children, specifically orphans after World War II. Because our country's been a pendulum, it took a while, but with the massive New Deal, liberalism kind of got a real strong foothold that's continued. But if you'll remember in the previous slide, conservatives and liberals both agreed that adoption was a great way to deal with the plight as they saw it. For the conservatives, to break up the culture and get rid of it. The liberals thinking, oh, we're helping these children by taking them out of these savage homes and giving them a better life to be raised in. It resulted in 1/3 of all Native children being removed from their families, their communities, and their culture. Without their children, they couldn't reproduce their culture. They couldn't pass on spiritual and religious beliefs and ceremonies. It was impossible to maintain their language. Their children weren't learning their language. They were learning English or Swedish or Italian, spoken by the white immigrants in the country. They couldn't follow their family trees. Their kinship relations were busted up. They weren't able to train new leaders to take over and keep the culture strong. And they lost their sovereign power. In the 70s, this resulted in a lot of activism by natives. They fought against it. They possessed Alcatraz. They had fish-ins in the Northwest. They worked with various groups that really pushed for native rights. And in 1978, it led to the Indian Child Welfare Act, which slowed down, if not stopped, Indian removal from their families, and helped start reuniting these families where they'd meet people that were their relatives that they hadn't seen in years.